In our last video, that's episode 6, we ended by looking forward to this video where we were going to compare the letter of James with the gospel accounts, starting, of course, with the gospel of Matthew, being the very first, obviously. However, the immediate question is, which gospel of Matthew? See, essentially, there are two, and they are fundamentally different. One is written in Greek and the other in Hebrew. Now let's explain this. See, in the Greek New Testament, Jesus says he came to give his life as a ransom for many. But in the Hebrew manuscript tradition of Matthew, and this is preserved in the Shem Tov manuscript, Jesus says something very different. He came to redeem many, or in some variations of that manuscript, to rescue many. Now, a ransom is a sacrifice. It's a substitutionary sacrifice. A rescue is deliverance by leadership. And these are really not the same message, are they? These two single words, redeem and ransom, may represent really the most important departure between the Greek and the Hebrew traditions of Matthew that we possess. So, what we're going to unpack today is what might be one of the most significant textual differences in the entire New Testament. In Matthew 20 and verse 28, which is really a cornerstone verse for the Christian atonement theology, for many, it really forms part of the biblical foundation for the belief that Jesus' death was a substitutionary sacrifice. His death pays the price for our human sins. But what if the earliest Hebrew tradition of Matthew didn't use the sacrificial word ransom at all? What if instead it used the Hebrew idea of redemption or even rescue, which of course carries no sacrificial connotation? So today we will compare the Greek with the Hebrew and unpack the history and explore what this difference means really for our understanding of the life and death of Jesus, and for understanding how Christianity developed in the early century. So let's begin with the Greek version found in all standard Bibles, Greek Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Here, two key terms carry the sort of theological weight, if you like. The first is ransom, lytron in Greek, and this is really a technical term, really meaning a price that is paid for the release of a slave or a captive. It is sort of transactional, if you like. I'll give you this in return for that. If we think in terms of buying, you hand over money and receive in return the product. And this idea is frequently used in Hellenistic religious and philosophical context to describe sacrificial liberations. And just a little bit more on this. There is another word, anti, which means for or instead of or in place of, and this implies substitution. So the Greek gives us to give his life as a sacrificial price in place of others. And of course, this is the foundation for this substitutionary atonement, the penal sacrifice concept. And this is the theological foundation, really, which is promoted by most religions today, and even much of the evangelical Christianity today. So, what happens if the earliest Hebrew tradition doesn't say ransom at all? What if it says something entirely different? And so here we have the Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew, preserved in a medieval Jewish manuscript. We find a copy of it in the British Library, and it contains very different wording. See, Shem Tov Matthew, chapter 20 and verse 28 reads this way: "The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life to redeem many." Some variations of that manuscript intensify the difference even more: a redemption for many, or to rescue many. See, the key point being the Hebrew never uses the word for ransom, which in Hebrew means kofar. In Greek, it's lytron. And even more importantly, another word, pidyon, doesn't mean a sacrificial payment. It actually means release. It means rescue, freedom from bondage, deliverance, liberation, the freeing of captives. Now, here's the kicker. When Jesus reads from the scroll of the book of Isaiah, chapter 61, Luke chapter 4 and verse 18, in your Bible, even though it's translated from Greek, it actually retains the concept of release, not sacrifice. So let's read it together. Luke 4:18. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to release the oppressed." Getting the picture? It's a divine rescue in the Exodus tradition, if you like, when they were released, but never the sacrificial ransom carried by this Greek word lytron. So when the Greek makes Jesus' death a transaction, the Hebrew makes Jesus' life a mission of deliverance. And these are two entirely different theological frameworks. So how can these two different meanings, how can they exist side by side? Well, there are three main possibilities. Possibility one, the Hebrew Shem Tov preserves really a very early Semitic tradition. Many scholars believe that Matthew was originally composed in a Semitic language, Hebrew or Aramaic. If so, the Shem Tov may preserve the fragments of that earlier tradition, release. And of course, there is support for this possibility. See, the Hebrew idioms in Shem Tov, well, they are not back translations from Greek. The grammar is often older than medieval Hebrew. The vocabulary, well, it aligns with Jewish Christian theology rather than the later Greek theology. Words like lifdot, to redeem, and lahassil, to rescue, well, they match Hebrew scripture, not the later Greek Hellenistic thought. Therefore, this likely represents the teachings of early Jewish believers in Jesus. This is before Paul's theology became dominant. There is, of course, another possibility. The Greek includes a later theological development, i.e., it sort of started with the Hebrew idiom and then developed into the Greek. And in this view, Mark, which is the earliest gospel written in Greek, but some 4 decades after Jesus' death, originally used the ransom language. And of course, Matthew followed. But the Hebrew tradition of Matthew preserved another strand of teaching. And this Semitic strand did not include the substitutionary sacrifice. And of course, this is consistent with the development of early Christianity, where different communities understood Jesus differently. Of course, we have a third possibility, not one which is really of any great importance. It's the polemic idea. What do I mean by polemic? Well, a polemic is an argument. It's actually sort of intellectual warfare. It is effective in rallying the faithful and drawing battle lines, but of course rarely at changing minds or fostering any constructive dialogue. In fact, the term polemic comes from the Greek polemikos, which means warlike. And so this possibility is less likely. See, a polemicist would simply remove the idea of Jesus giving his life completely, not trying to rewrite it into some prophetic non-sacrificial form. Jewish polemic texts usually they just eliminate Christian claims, not reinterpret them with correct Hebrew idioms. No. So this makes Shem Tov's reading far too authentic Hebrew for it to be dismissible as a simple medieval rewrite. No. Therefore, 2 Gospels emerge. Greek Matthew, which is a sacrificial atonement model where Jesus saves the world by dying as a ransom, paying the price, substituting himself for others, and thus fulfilling this sort of sacrificial economy of sin and guilt. And this, of course, aligns with Paul. It aligns with Greek theological development, later church doctrine. Shem Tov, on the other hand, Shem Tov Matthew, well, it is a prophetic redemption model. See, Jesus saves the world by obedience, by faithfulness, leadership, enduring suffering as a righteous servant, Isaiah 53, liberating people through example and command, calling people back to covenant faithfulness. And of course, this aligns with the Hebrew prophets, the message of James, early Jewish Christian communities. And guess what? The Sermon on the Mount. In other words, Jesus' actual teachings, where there's no ransom, there's no substitution, there's no transaction, just redemption through life-giving obedience. Now, below is a link to a video by Dr. James Tabor, which I think you'll find very helpful. And it's entitled, How Does Hebrew Matthew Compare with the Greek? And there's a URL there, which we'll put in the credits for you. Have a listen. It's about 15 minutes long, so, it'll take a bit of time. But the Greek Matthew, chapter 20 and verse 28, Mark is really a copy, really, of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, where the term ransom for many is used. But of course, Mark is Greek through and through, and Mark uses ransom, and therefore Matthew follows Mark, because Mark was that first Gospel. So, are we getting what's going on here? See, the Shem Tov uses redeem. This strongly suggests Matthew existed in really multiple forms, one Greek, one Hebrew. And the Hebrew form, which is of course the Shem Tov, preserved a non-sacrificial interpretation of Jesus' life and death. Now, this may be one of the clearest examples of how different early Christian communities actually understood Jesus' death. So, what do we make of this? We have two ancient streams of interpretation. In Greek, Jesus' death is a payment, a transaction, his life for ours. In Hebrew, Jesus' life is a redemptive mission that liberates people. Luke 4:18. Now, both cannot be the same, can they? And the difference really between them, it really opens a window into the earliest diversity within the Christian movement. A diversity that later church history often tried to either harmonize unsuccessfully or indeed suppress more successfully. So now, in the forthcoming videos, we will explore what this means for reading and understanding the Gospels through the eyes of Jesus' own Jewish audience and his early Jewish disciples. Remember, of course, that Jesus' ministry encompassed not only the Jews, but also the Samaritans and other non-Jewish communities, for instance, in the Decapolis. Now, I am producing a PDF for further reference and will make it available for a download later on. So from next week, we will cover the comparison between James's letter and Matthew's Gospel, keeping both these versions in mind. I think you may be somewhat surprised at what comes out of that comparison, and indeed as we move along with the other Gospels. So until next time, thank you very much, and see you then.